There are now some specialized AI models that are now small enough to fit in your pocket. That's your phone. And now the latest headline is small enough to put in the battlefield. Welcome to the Headline AI Podcast, where we unpack the latest AI news through a VC lens. Now, last week, Gemini Live, which is this AI experience on your phone, it was amazing. You can talk to it. The amount of power and utility that AI could just be in your pocket was stunning. At the same time, these AI models they're open source. And Sasha, you're saying the top headline today is that same type of AI technology is finding its way to the battlefield. So what have you found?
Yeah, so some of these transformer architecture models and vision models are, being miniaturized, and a lot of the algorithmic optimization that we're unlocking as well, and the parameter count being able to shrink for some of these models means that they can fit on consumer hardware. And that has fantastic implications for the devices in your pocket, because you can do more and you have much more privacy. But when you look at some of the other mechanics around the world and some of the other places we're using these devices in novel ways, unfortunately, they're making their way to the battlefield. And this is changing some of the mechanics of warfare in a way.
So, drones, as you know, in the early part of the Ukraine-Russia war, a lot of the drones were the drones that you could buy at Best Buy, and they were the ones that they were utilizing. But of course, drone technology is not just that. There's a whole open source community around DIY drones, and those are the ones now they're utilizing it. So the consumer kind of innovated, not the Defense Department. And similarly, AI is the exact same thing, where all the innovations coming on the consumer side, and now Department of Defense and others, or and those type of organizations are borrowing all that innovation.
Yeah, exactly. And you're getting to a point where the chip architecture is really what's accelerated a lot of this. Having the ability to process and having that architecture that from both a software and a hardware perspective that can see, even if it's 1 frame per second, that's all it needs to accommodate. And it can identify a potential target, and then in the context, especially in some of these formats now, can run these models locally. It means it no longer needs a operator to basically direct the drone where to go. And this is a huge change to the mechanics of warfare, because you can have swarm technology where thousands of drones are deployed, and they can relay information to each other, see a target, communicate in real time, again at superhuman, what we would perceive as superhuman speed, and then basically assess the situation and then execute an attack. And this is going to yield some pretty devastating damage, and it's going to be, like you said, like it's a mechanic that wasn't developed by the Defense Department, so it isn't something that people have developed countermeasures for. You've got companies like Anduril out there, but as far as I know, there is no defense for swarm drones coupled with locally hosted models, because you can't radar jam them because they've got a Faraday cage. You can't do kinetic impact because there's too many of them. How would you make sure that you have 500 counter drones in any given location? It would just be too difficult to develop that many. So when you look at this, it really is changing some of the mechanics of warfare. And some people might wonder, like, well, why are you talking about this on a VC podcast? And the reality is, this impacts the landscape, and you have to look at geopolitical stability as part of your mandate and as part of your assessment of the situation. And unfortunately, this is one that I don't know if many people know how it's going to change. It's one that is increasing VUCA, which is like volatility, uncertainty, those sorts of things. So this is one to be seen in terms of how it plays out.
To the world of phones, and Gemini Live came out, and we were watching that demo. Most of what was happening on the screen was on the cloud. But a lot of the parts that were maybe dealing with your personal data, it potentially means that they're using Gemini Nano, which is their smaller model, runs on lesser hardware, and they can kind of merge the two. But reality is the latency was felt, and going back to the cloud and coming back. And so there's going to be increasing innovation around bringing these models to the hardware, to the chips, as you were saying, or making the chips better. Both and, right? And so I think what we're seeing with Gemini Live is just maybe tip of the spear in terms of what will happen and what people will be more accustomed to when it comes to AI in their pockets.
Yeah, and if you think, going back to when we're talking about Search GPT, like a lot of the power and benefit of having these models locally is like you unlock privacy. Because you can have this local model stripping out all of your personal information and then going to, the big brother or sister in the cloud, the big model with the reasoning capability, and saying, hey, I'm stuck on ABC. Can you help me navigate these web pages? What do I do? And this is all happening on your behalf, right? And the local model is stripping out that information so you feel comfortable sending and leveraging the cloud model. So it's a massive unlock in the mechanics of what people will feel comfortable sending and sharing with these models, I think.
We're going to take a shift into academia. And the headline that you surfaced is Sakana AI. They launched an AI scientist for automated scientific research. And I looked into it. You're saying that they have now figured out how to teach AI to write papers, academic papers, which is kind of like a little meta, a little circular. But they developed a training algorithm that can actually rank papers for, they score papers. They probably look at peer reviews and what journals they were able to be published in. And so they have a training model that can figure out how good a paper is. And then they started to utilize LLMs to generate papers. And then actually they're scoring above the normal scores that you typically see by human generated papers, which is kind of scary.
It is. And honestly, this story sounds on the face of it so like what's the big deal? Like, you've automated scientific research papers. But the scientific method, especially in the context of AI, is something that's being very, very closely watched by AI researchers. And there's a very specific reason why Sakana went out and developed down this pathway. The thought process here is, if we can get the models to do their own research and they understand what the bottlenecks of their own development are, they can then power and do a lot of their own research and development to improve themselves. So this is really seen as one of the core flywheels and one of the highest risk factors for AI becoming AGI, going from AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, to ASI, which is artificial superintelligence. That flywheel and the time frame that it takes to get from one to the other is influenced very heavily by this. I mean, this is very much at the early stages where it's basically automating the process and it's going through the research life cycle, but it is the fact that it can do it is a very, very interesting development. So this is one I think the research community is especially following very closely, and it made headlines. And a lot of the people that I follow on Twitter and X were basically talking about this, like, wow, this is a pretty sizable and significant step towards AGI and ASI.
And I was reading that the only thing that these papers were getting wrong were the key artifacts. They were developing some algorithms and code to sort of prove out their thesis. And there were some fallacies and some breakage inside the actual code that they were writing. But that kind of transitions us to the next headline, which is Cosine AI. They claim to have built the most capable AI software engineer, AI that can code. So these papers that we're talking about, they just couldn't write good code to prove themselves out, but everything else was pretty solid about them. Here we have a company, Cosine AI. They're actually saying that they've built an AI software engineer and has scored 30% on the SWE benchmark. I don't know how much I would score, but it was really interesting because they designed it to mimic human software engineering. So for example, when I'm coding or one of our folks are coding, they're looking for the files that are relevant to a problem. And after you find the files, then you look at, what are the possible changes you would make. Then you should run some unit tests against it. And after the unit tests, you want to write, some more code and test it out on a browser. And it's really interesting. The AI actually walks through the steps that a typical engineer would do. So I was pretty impressed, but at the same time, I was like, I don't know. Can this really code as good as a software engineer? I don't know. What do you think?
I think the answer is no. And it's going to be a little while still. But when I say a little while, I'm not saying 5-10 years. I'm saying probably less than 3 years. And a lot of the mistakes that these models make right now are reasoning and logic mistakes, because they're being trained on a corpus of data, and there's only so much that you can actually do from that perspective. So the way we've gone from Devon and basically doubling the score and things like that in such a short period of time is we're bootstrapping reasoning through these artificial checkpoints, and it might be tree of thought or chain of thought, those sorts of things. And there's a whole bunch of research papers that have gone out and spoken about these techniques. But really, like, once we crack reasoning, and that's actually built at the generalist model level, and the APIs that you're calling on actually have that inherently built in, I think that's where you're going to see some of the biggest leaps here.
These models don't understand reason too well. They say, well, here's a scaffold. First, figure out what files might be relevant. So that they do that test. And the second is, okay, what would you change about the files? And then you write some unit tests against it and test it to make sure it works so you don't break anything. But that's that's a very weak scaffold because you're hoping that it got each of these steps right. And so we're trying to kind of help this handicapped AI be a good software engineer, but I'm not sure on the results. But you're saying that, well, if they crack reasoning at the very fundamental core, then all the scaffolding, all of these crutches that we're giving to the AI actually won't be as necessary.
Yeah, and having the feedback loop at an individual step level and understanding what were the milestones, what are my goalposts and what are the individual milestones, and reflecting on each one of the milestones. Right now, you can actually, when you look at some of these demo videos, you can see it's just essentially trying to brute force one of these pathways, and then it'll get to the very end and then try it all over again. But like we spoke about, there's some of these like decision trees that you have to basically feel out 2 or 3 of these nodes first at much lower levels of the decision tree hierarchy, and then basically take that information, refactor it in. All this to say is just like reasoning will basically move the needle here. But again, you have to keep in mind, I mean, Devon came out, maybe 6 months ago max, and you're seeing the scores double. So if you just extrapolate some of the development and the rate of innovation here, like you can see a pretty clear trend, right?
I don't like this headline. It puts my job at risk. Anyways, the next headline is GPT-4o reclaims the top spot. Of course, I predicted it. So ChatGPT 4o on the chatbot arena, they scored 1314, surpassing Google Gemini 1.5 Pro experimental. There's 11,000 community votes went to flag that this so-called anonymous chatbot was scoring higher in math, coding, instruction following, and a number of others. And the other headline is that XAI, which is Elon's AI company, released Grok 2, and it on first first test was number 3 on the chatbot arena, which is pretty amazing for a first gen sort of release of the Grok 2 system. So pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, another week, another leader. And I totally agree, like a phenomenal win for Grok 2 to get that high so quickly, and in terms of like the resources they've got access to relative to the Googles. And I think it goes back to some of the stuff that we were saying last week around, hey, I think there will be 4 or 5 players that crack an eventual AGI nut. And it also shows that like the amount of investment isn't in the orders of billions of dollars potentially. You see the open source community pioneering here really quickly. You've got teams with sub $1 billion clusters going out and doing this stuff. So I think it changes a lot of the equation here for, let's say, these Fortune 1000 companies that could realistically say, hey, why don't we go off and do this? And I think ultimately the limiting factor ends up being the technical talent. And you've seen a lot of the leaders in this space say that research is, again, the limiting factor, and their ability to go from research paper to product. So again, for the people that are interested in space and want to know what's coming next and how these benchmarks might evolve, I think the research papers are the best place to go.
All right, the last headline we'll cover today is Anthropic unveils prompt caching. It's a little nerdy, but this prompt caching is promising 90% cost savings, 85% faster AI responses. So usually, let's say you have a document and you're asking different questions to the same document. Right now, you have to send that document over and over again back to the prompt. It's very expensive, especially if that document is long. Or let's say you have a long like customer care query going on and it's taking a while, and maybe they have to come back the next day to answer you and things like that. And so you can't carry that conversation across many days. So Anthropic released prompt caching, which basically says you can cache that portion of the document and they're not going to charge you a lot of money to keep reusing it. And when Sasha shared this with me, it was like a feature, but I was like, wow, I know Gemini, they do prompt caching. Anthropic does it now. I don't know if OpenAI is thinking about doing it. But the interesting thing is that Anthropic's implementation of prompt caching is a little bit different than Gemini's. It has different pricing structure, different expiration, just different functionality, which is really interesting to me because it's telling me that, up to this point, we've been switching back and forth between the different LLM models. Like, this week, OpenAI releases ChatGPT 4o, so I'm going to switch it out and then I'm good to go. It seems now, and it would seem to be in the interest of a lot of these LLM providers, that they would offer these nice features on top of their LLMs that would lock you into their way of using it. So you may not be as easily going to be able to, make these LLMs as fungible and just switch them out back and forth.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting insight because the pricing wars get to a point where it's like, hey, as long as you lock in for at least a 5-minute window with us, we'll reduce your price by 90% and the latency will. So it's both on a capability and on a cost perspective. So I think that's a super interesting mechanic. And it goes back to actually, again, what we we're talking about last week. And then you'll see some of these ecosystems develop very specific applications and hardware and the end-to-end process to accommodate specific needs and capabilities. And I think Anthropic is I take this as we're trying to capture the API market, and we want to make sure that all of your API like batch processing, like brute forcing of tasks, those sorts of things, we want to be that workhorse for you.
And they're storing that content for you. I mean, there's an expiration today, but you can see that this can persist out, and now your data now just lives with Anthropic and it doesn't have to be forwarded back to them. So, all right. Well, thank you, Sasha, for the headlines, and keep them coming, and we'll see you next week.
Sounds good. See ya.